does the metal of or the composite alter the identity of a watch?
Dramatically. I think, well, the great thing is we're blessed with collections of watches, whether it's the Omega Speedmaster, the Tudor Black Bay, we can look at collections and then you see the iteration across the materials and it completely and utterly redefines the watch. And it redefines the watch for the wearer as well, because you might not wear a stainless steel executed case in the same way or at the same time or even in the same manner as you would wear a decorated gem set version, or not the case of Tudor clearly, but a model which has been treated in a slightly different way. We saw the DLC Tudor Black Bay this year. I mean, fundamentally it's a different watch. And it's not different watch in the sense that it no longer belongs to that collection, because every element of it still resides in the design of the watch. But it just gives it a completely different personality. And I think that's when we're talking about what are the brands doing when they're working through different materials. It's about playing with the personalities. It's about saying, well, it can be this, but could it be that? Now, sometimes those gear changes don't really work, and you can see watches that are clearly too big being executed in finishes that offer a refinement that doesn't really sit very well with the scale of the piece, and vice versa. Actually, you can see pieces that were once dress watches being sort of redefined through the use of materials into being given the attributes more familiar to other types of watches. But the personality shifts is, I think, what keeps the brands interested in doing it. And I think it's what the customer's looking for as well, because they want that opportunity to choose what sort of reflective idea that watch is giving out.
On the flip side, do you think that some watches, if they're strong enough, can be made or enhanced, not enhanced, if we're used to it in steel, if it's made in different materials, or any watch material that we're used to, it's going to stand the test of time, if the model itself is strong enough?
Yeah, I think it comes back to those attributes, which it has to be effectively a stellar design in its own right. On a technical level, or indeed a practical level, if there are more elements that can be played with, I mentioned earlier about how complex some cases are actually constructed. If there are elements to the case that allow for different elements of the actual case to be switched out, as we see it particularly in Hublot, but obviously we know from the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, and I think probably the shining example for this is the Santos de Cartier, because that has all the emblematic elements of the Santos watch, but extraordinary ability to switch out different parts of the case and bezel and screws to give it different executions. So I think really that is where the quality lies. But you have to start with a watch that has its own imprint. I mean, it has to exist in and of itself. And really then, as the sky's the limit, or whatever cliche you wish to use, it really comes down to the sort of imagination of the designers. And we saw those lovely lacquered pieces, didn't we, in Cartier? Did you see those?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they're gorgeous. And Santos lacquered Santoses. I'd never seen it.
Well, they weren't specifically. If you weren't to know it was a Cartier, you wouldn't necessarily identify it as a Cartier.
Yeah.
However, I thought it was one of the strongest watches of the fair. And the year before, they'd done them as one shots anywhere only.
Oh, right.
Whereas this year they'd introduced it when they had the green, the red, and the blue dials, and the black. They've introduced this year as a core piece. But it's funny you should say "sky's the limit." The question, and this is. I was just thinking when I asked the question, what can I think of? You've used Santos. If a watch is strong enough, can it be made in any? And I think the Moon watch lends itself. After we've seen them, sort of the success of it, it's a bestseller for us. It's an icon around the world. It's the strongest watch for Omega. But then they introduced it in the Sedna Gold, the Canopus, and the Moonshine this year, back to the yellow gold. And they keep enhancing it or not changing it, but they're producing it in these other metal ways. So I think, to your point, if the core of the watch is strong enough, sky's the limit for the brand.
Moon is the limit.
Well, absolutely, literally. But I mean,
if you could choose any material, let's forget about what's currently out there. What if the brands could come to you and say, we're rendering a watch in this? What would you like it to be made from?
I suppose it depends which watch.
Okay.
And I'm trying to buy myself time now. Thank you. I'm trying to buy myself some time now. It's like with any watch fair. I only remember the first thing I've seen and the last thing I've seen. I am really taken with yellow gold at the moment because we haven't seen so much of it. So I think, and then which model would it be in? I'm taken with yellow gold, so I'm stepping away from which model would it be
that's
made
fine.
in.
We can be brand neutral.
Thank you very much. Yeah. But also, it doesn't lend itself to everything. I mean, this particular watch, Panerai do gold watches. They're very heavy. You know, this you've already referenced is incredibly light. I think it almost does depend on the watch. I mean, the cuff that we've selected here by the Panther, Cartier's Panther. It's beautiful. It's a piece of jewelry. It's not a watch. Controversially, and I might upset a few people by saying that. It's brilliant that it has the functionality of telling the time as well. But what I absolutely love about that, and it's for me, it's very 80s. It's very elegant. I think sort of French chic. When I look at that, but equally that can't be made in that material, I don't think, and vice versa. So I think it depends. To go back to your question, I think it depends on the watch. Yeah. But I'm going to ask you your question.
No. Well, I was just thinking about, we've talked a lot about case materials, or rather I have, and to a certain extent around bracelets and how they allow for the materials to be switched out. But we haven't really talked about dials and hands and indices, and actually, I just reflecting again, we all stay brand neutral, but something, and it was triggered by your mention of the moon watch and also the sky. I love asteroids, I love any meteorites, I love anything that's come from out of space and has now ended up on a watch. And I know it's come into the Earth's atmosphere in order to do so, but I just love the idea that this thing has been buzzing through the universe for millions of years, and then I'm wearing a sliver of it as a dial of a watch. And we haven't really talked about how materials do really impact on dial design, and how obviously we talk a lot about chronographs, and particularly those with contrast subdials, and they can be silvered against a black or a white dial. And Zenith, of course, the El Primero, they have always used different colored subdials to reflect the different iterations of the El Primero Chronomaster. But there are so many elements to mixed materials in watchmaking. It's almost another talk, Faye, to be talking about what lies within the watch. But if we go into skeletonizing now, the skeletonizing is using more and more synthetics within the construction of the bridges and the barrels. And so fundamentally, there's no end. We are going down a long rabbit hole now of how materials affect the very nature of a watch, right down to the construction of the movement. So really, to separate, as we haven't done, but to separate materials from a watch model and the movement that it contains is I think is an elementary mistake. It should be treated as the third leg on the stool.